today we are sketching this. This is a bright, joy-filled landscape. This is from near Derwentwater in the Lake District where we were recently on holiday. What we've got is a sketch made with one line, but thinking about it in layers, from the most distant to the next layer forward, to these middle layers, to the foreground. And by thinking about it in layers, despite going quickly around with one big looping line, we're actually able to structure our sketch, feel like we're going through a process, and therefore end up with something really fun and really successful. And we're just going to use any waterproof pen. I've got my TWSBI Diamond 580 with carbon ink, watercolours and some paper, and we are just going to bring this sketch to life basically in a very simple fashion. And that very simple fashion, of course, is going to start with the idea of capturing the whole scene in a continuous line. So in this scene, what we've got is layers. So we've got, and I'm going to explain a bit more as we go, we've got a sort of middle or background layer, which is all these trees. And these trees we're going to find as little shapes. And the shapes are kind of circles. We're going to find some of the actual shapes there, but we're also going to just see what works as we move around with our one single line, and just get this overlapping nature of these trees. Underneath the trees is a lot darker, so the lines perhaps can be bolder, or you can do lots of hatched lines. And then we're getting towards the kind of little hillock, and at the hillock they get a bit thinner, they become more sort of pokey, and they're also more golden, something to pay attention to when we add our colours. Then there's another sort of part of this layer which is coming towards us, and then it's moving away again. So what we're doing is we're finding the little shapes. We're also focusing on this flow, the bigger sense of the scene. We're not worrying actually much about texture, you'll notice. Often I say, always do texture in your lines, but we are doing a little bit of that, a little bit of wobble and things, but really we're focusing on just getting the flow through this scene, and a lot of the texture can then come through watercolours. Behind this layer we've got the most distant layer, and that's this little hillock that we were talking about earlier. We can capture that again, all in one single line. Then we can kind of come forward, we can just drag our pen through and find this kind of green layer, which gets rudely interrupted by this grassy, meadowy feel. And now we'll capture that, and my way of capturing that in this kind of loose and a bit abstract way, very abstract way, is through just vertical lines, suggesting those kind of reeds. In the middle we've got this road, that's our closest layer, and then we've got these same kind of reeds, or I think it's just tall grass coming along. And I'm just going to do the same again to capture all of that. And then as we come forward, we can get these kind of more swirly, clumpy lumps of grass. And like that, our scene is done. I'm going to continue my line to include my initials and hide my signature somewhere up in the sketch as well. And now we can have the real fun. The real fun, of course, in this case, is splashing some colours on. And look at that sky, it's pretty epic. So I'm going to let the watercolours do the hard work here. The watercolours can be painting themselves. If we just get the water down fairly neatly to the edge of our kind of distant layers, what we'll find is we can now come in and just touch. I'm going to start with a little bit of indigo for that real underlying mood. And then I'm going to touch on top of that. We've got these bright blues, and they're just moody because they've got that sort of real tone to them. So let's just see what happens when we start touching in little bits of cobalt blue here and there. There's also a kind of opacity to this scene, isn't there? There's an opacity to that sky. It doesn't feel like it's see-through. So a lovely way to use to get that effect is to use a semi-opaque colour. And here I've got lavender, which is a colour you may have seen me using quite a lot recently. And it's a lovely, soft, gentle colour, but it's also semi-opaque. So when you add it to a sky, you add it to anything, it has a presence. It definitely sort of sits there. It really feels like it's, taking over the scene if you're not careful. But if you are careful, it's just adding something to the scene. It's adding a very different feel, very different texture. Another way of getting this kind of loose feel is to come in and just splash those colours around, then soften them out with some more water. And that's going to enable us to get even more of these kind of heavy lifting colours from the watercolour without us actually having to do much of the work ourselves. I'm going to try and get some more intense blues. This sky really is deeply intense, so I do want it to, you know, be intense in my image. I don't want to lose that intensity and make it too gentle, too soft. Over here the sky's actually quite flat, so I'm going to flatten that out with some gentle brush strokes. And what I'm doing to flatten it is I'm not lifting my brush. If I lift my brush lots, I'll get lots of texture. If I do one soft brush stroke, I will manage to flatten it out significantly. Then coming forwards, I can find some of these lines. So I can use my brush, a bit of water on it, and I can add water to push apart these colours. And what we're doing is we're finding with that the perspective of the sky, and also you might notice there's a big sort of patch of light in here. We can do that with some water. The water will push away the colours and it will sort of flow and push outwards and give us that perspective naturally. Anything else to add? Maybe a little bit more of these really dark and punchy colours just in a couple of places. Because it's nice and wet, I can add these. As long as I'm gentle, I can add these, and I know that they will soften for ages. So we don't need to be too worried. As long as we're being gentle, as long as there's loads of water for things to gradually move around, we can be pretty confident that we're not going to have ruined things just by going too hard. Now coming forward, what have we got? Well, we've got all these lovely bright greens. I'm going to jump a layer. I'm going to jump down into what I called this bright green, not meadowy layer, but sort of grassy layer, isn't it? It's sort of the only really happy layer. All the others have got some kind of melodrama going on in their colours, in how they're coming across. And this is just quite a nice, pleasant, flat kind of green. And having done that, we can go up. We can go up and start working in some of these autumnal colours. So we've got these very sort of orange, yellow, golden colours up here. So I'm using a mix now of quinacridone sienna and Mars yellow to get these rich colours coming up. Same here, these little pokey trees. And what I want to happen as I'm doing this, what I'm trying to induce is a little bit of mixing. So our little happy green layer becomes intertwined with our moodier autumnal layer. I can take a moody green now and I'll start working into these trees, which have got much more green about them, but they do have light and shadow. And in that light, you might agree, you might see with me a couple of yellows again. So that's where I'm going to mix in that Mars yellow, which is similar to a yellow ochre really. Going to mix that in and just allow things to blend and splurge around the page. Last but not least, I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap in the top here. I want some space. We've got a bit of negative space in this, but I also want another kind of colour in there. So I'm going to get my violet, and you can, I hope again, agree. These things are sometimes quite subjective, but I think you can agree. There's a little pink or a little purple or a little violet going on in these, what I called reedy areas. So I'm going to just get that idea before jumping back to some of our colours we've already used before. This is Green Apatite Genuine. That's this moody green, which you can see spreading happily around the rest of the page. And then to really keep the image feeling connected, we've then got some of our happy green just to reflect what's going on above. This path, perhaps all we need is just a little bit of texture. So I'm kind of going to scrub and dry brush, maybe use some of these darker neutrals that I used up in the sky as well. And then whilst things are still wet, let's get some more texture going in this sky. We can do that by splashing a bit of water. That water wasn't as clean as I hoped, so I'm actually going to just recognise that, not panic, but recognise it wasn't quite as clean as I hoped, and just lift it out. And even if you want, you can just remove it by popping a little bit more colour in there. And what's left to do? What is left to do? Well, I think I'm actually just going to let this dry, And then we'll move on. We'll add our bolder colours, maybe a little extra structure. And before you know it, we'll have finished this quite interesting, very simple one-line landscape. And here we go. We are drier, not totally dry, but we are certainly drier than we were before. And now I'm just going to focus my colours on these shapes. So we've got these shapes that we drew in at the very beginning, and within those shapes I'm going to emphasize light and shadow, for example. So we can do that here by just doubling down on this deep green. And I'm not going to splash everything everywhere this time. I'm just going to focus on getting those contrasts going across our shapes, but also doubling down on the fact that this is a shape-based sketch, that we have simple shapes making up the most part of our sketch. Again, I can just change my brown. So I was using a bit of quinacridone sienna there. Now I'm going to use a bit of Van Dyke brown, just move around and find the kind of depth underneath all of these shapes, because they have, we talked about at the beginning, they have this kind of shadow at their base, and they have a bit of shadow on the left hand side as well, for the most part from the angle of the sun, from the angle of the light in this image. Going up, we've got just these swirly loose shapes. Don't need to overdo it, don't need to overstate what we're trying to achieve. Then I'm going to come down with my violet again, which we were debating whether I was correct in finding there. So I'd love to hear in the comments what you think. What colours do you see which I haven't used, or that you disagree with that I have used? Going on the right, let's get these same ideas. And you can see hopefully that I'm just trying to get the shapes again, just simulating the same shapes with brush marks. And coming forwards, we can just get all these big brush marks. We can then add some deeper, different ones. So this is a little bit of extra indigo in with that colour. And coming forwards, we can use the same again. And then coming forwards again, we've got these tufts of grass. So using my small brush, I can kind of suggest these tufts of grass now, instead of just big, strong, long grass in the distance. We've also got these little tufty bits, maybe even a little bit more cobalt green in there, just to lift it a tiny bit. And is there anything else to do? Well, there's always stuff we can do, as I always say. I think I repeat myself far too often sometimes. But I think just a little bit of texture here, and maybe a little bit more doubling down of some of this darkness. But we don't want to overwork it. This is supposed to be light, loose, free, quick, the kind of thing that you could achieve. You could sit in this field and you could very quickly sketch out these shapes, sketch out the feel of the scene, and end up going home with a really lovely sketch without having to have waited for hours and hours and hours. Getting very busy with some of these marks, but I think they're working still. I think the busyness is bringing everything closer. The more busy it is, the more dense, the more contrasting, the closer it feels. And then I'm going to do my little favourite few splashes just around this sky. Well, you can see it's still a little bit wet. I'm going to take some of this lavender and also get that splashed in and around, and also just use that lavender down here. Again, I'm feeling the sky's disconnected from the rest of the scene, but if I use some of the same colours from that sky, if I just find them, pop them in the foreground of the scene a little bit, suddenly that sky connects to the landscape. That's my take on what I'm trying to achieve anyway. Anything else? Yeah, let's do a little bit more blue in some of these trees again. I like a little bit of cobalt blue to kind of lift deep shadows. I think it adds a kind of life and vibrancy. Obviously it's again very subjective whether that's a good thing to do or a bad thing, but I'm quite enjoying this sketch. I'm quite enjoying how it's flowing, coming towards us. I'm going to let it dry now, and then we'll see if we want to restructure, if we want to add some finishing touches to what we've got going on here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually take a different pen. I'm going to take a pen, this has got some grey ink in, and I'm going to use this grey ink instead of my black ink. I'm going to use this grey ink to kind of softly restructure some of these areas. And I'm hoping, I've not done this before actually, this is an experiment, but my imagination is that this will prevent overdoing it, but also give a kind of interesting two-tone look to our lines, and also hopefully add just enough structure. And if it doesn't work, if it doesn't get enough structure in there, then I can always add a bit of black ink as well. And all I try to do is just get a sort of, you can see it's providing a kind of soft silvery effect to some of these lines. So it's probably not as bold as I was imagining it might come out, and that's fine. So I'm learning as I do it. I'm not overdoing it. I'm being quite gentle. And what I'll be able to do is, because it's not as bold, I'll be able to actually do a lot of extra little detail marks, little bits of sort of texture and things, which I wouldn't dare do with a black pen. But maybe what we'll need to do is just come back in with a bit of a black pen as well and see if there's more to do after. And let's do that now. So let's have a look with a black pen. Are there actually little touches we want to do? Going to again change to a really fine pen here. And perhaps just see, let's see what happens if we just bolden up some of these lines. Don't want to overdo it. We've already come in with extra pen. We've already got quite busy pen work going on. So I'm focusing on making the bottom edges of these rather bolder. Just the bottom edges, maybe a few more little suggestions of these reedy, twiggy bits of grass, maybe a few more little suggestions of shape here, and maybe just making this a tiny bit neater, just a tiny bit. And I think if I leave it there, maybe just a tiny bit of hatching on that. And to make that hatching not lonely, tiny bit of hatching in a couple of other places. And there we go. I'm definitely now going to call that one done. Very loose, quite lively, quite fun, gradually getting more busy sketch as we come forward. Let me know what you think. Do join in, have a go. The reference is linked down below. Been wonderful sketching along with you today, and so I will see you in the next video. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.